Hi, my name is Chris Eliasmith. I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo and director of the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. And I want to talk to you today about the integration between neuroscience and cognitive science from a computational perspective and how that's influenced my work. So let me just quickly pull up my presentation. So in this context, I want to talk in particular about one model that we've built called SPAWN, which I'll describe to you in a little bit more detail throughout the talk. And really it's an example of integrating low-level neurobiological information with cognitive performance. And the way that we've done that is basically by taking a computational perspective, meaning that we understand the brain as a signal processor, we understand cognitive performance as the result of algorithms and representations being computed over, and try to figure out how we can sort of bridge the gap from biology to cognition with our models. And I referred to this kind of technique or this general style of modeling as biological cognition, one where we're trying to incorporate biological insights at the same time as we're trying to explain high-level cognitive behavior. We also think it's important in general that when we increase the complexity of our model, that we're doing it to increase function. Now, there's many reasons you might want to have a more complicated biological model, ranging from trying to replicate particular voltage recordings inside the brain, or replicate the statistics of spike patterns. But in our hands, we want to increase complexity when we get more sophisticated cognitive function out. And for this reason, the kind of individual component we use, that is neuron, tends to be reasonably simple. It's a leaky integrate and fire neuron. But it's also more sophisticated in two critical ways than standard artificial neural network neurons. One of those is that it uses spikes to communicate. So this is something that brains also do. And a consequence of that, and the second important way in which it's different, is that it fundamentally models time. So all of the elements in our neurons have time constants, and we simulate them with respect to time. So time is an integral part of the behavior of the individual components, and hence an integral part of the overall model once we've built it. We introduce other physiological parameters like cell membrane, time constants, and synapses and neurotransmitters and so on. These are also important for modeling time. And in that regards, there are sort of significant and core differences between what we're doing here with our spiking biological brain models and what you typically see in artificial neural networks. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't use many of the same kinds of techniques. So the particular model I want to talk about is called SPAWN. This stands for Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network. The first version of this model is actually chapter 7 of this How to Build a Brain book. It was also published in Science in 2012. And it's a very large-scale brain model simulated in a software package called Mango. Both of these you can download and use and play with on your own. The original model was about 2.5 million neurons. The new version is about 6.6 million neurons. And of course, given what I said on the previous slide, this means that we have a lot more behavior sort of incorporated into the model. And I'll talk about some of those in more detail as we go. In particular, one way of quantifying the sort of complexity of the model is by counting the number of tasks it can perform. So the original model could do 8 tasks. The new model could do 12, which was those 8 plus 4 more. These tasks can include things like recognizing digits in the original model and now recognizing images out of any of 1,000 different categories. In the original case, we had a model that could sort of draw a couple of different answers, and it was a fairly rigid motor system in some ways, and the new model has an adaptive motor system, which is much more flexible and generalizable. Probably the most sort of core cognitive ability that we've added to the model, the original model could do sort of simple intelligence tests and things like that, which we really placed most of our sort of cognitive hopes in, as it were. The new model now does instruction following, which we think is interestingly more sophisticated and flexible than what we had in the original model. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as well in detail. So to give you some examples of these kinds of tasks, this is the model doing a stimulus comparison task. So it's being shown 2 images, and it writes 0 if they're different categories and 1 if they're the same category. So here's an example of 2 dogs, and then it writes a 1. The same visual system can recognize digits and write out the digits that it sees. But the interesting thing, so I guess one important point here is that we can perform exactly the same experiments on the model that we can on humans and animals. We just show an input image and we can record the output motor commands. which is nice, gives us this kind of all the way through type of modeling. But of course, unlike biological systems, we have access to literally every state inside the model that matters for the behavior. So we can, for instance, look at what's going on in the higher areas of the visual system. So this might be IT, and we can directly decode the spikes that are being used to encode information there and see what that would tell us about the outside world. But of course, to perform this task, we also need a working memory. We have to store that information long enough so we can get the system to write that out. So here's an example of working memory in a more frontal area. And lastly, we need motor systems. And here we're showing sort of the trajectory that the motor system is determining at a high level is appropriate in this context. And then, there's more sort of motor system hierarchy to take care of actually figuring out how to move the muscles and get the arm to transition through the right sort of path. So the arm itself is physically modeled. It has mass and length and links and all this kinds of stuff, and it's controlled by muscles. So simple perceptual task, and Spawn does a couple of those. But more interestingly, it does some high-level cognitive tasks as well. So this is an example of what I like to think of as sort of mental gymnastics, where you give a series of instructions to the model, like you might give to a subject in a human experiment, psychological experiment. And then you say, okay, do instruction number 1, then do instruction number 2 and instruction number 3, and tell me as you're doing these things, like, what are your mental representations like? Or you could ask the same question at the very end after all of the tasks have been performed. So in this particular case, the first instruction, find a pattern, means I'm going to show you some digits and you have to figure out what the relationship is between those digits. This is patterned after this intelligence test, Raven progressive matrices, but a much simpler version. The second subtask is to do question answering, meaning I'm going to show you a bunch of digits and then ask you about them. The third one, it says apply the pattern to the list. Apply in this case means to perform counting. So if you have a 2 and your list is 1, 2, then you are basically counting 1 and 2 up by 2, so you'd get 3 and 4. And lastly, apply the pattern to the position. Question means basically take some information I asked you about earlier and add that to this position, to this pattern information. Okay, so the very first thing it's going to do is find a pattern. Let's watch that. So it's starting at subtask 1, and it's shown at 1 and then a 3, and then it's shown a 2 and then a 4, and it infers, the pattern is increased by 2. So now it's being shown 3 digits and asked what's in position 2, so it writes out a 7. Then it's being told apply that pattern, which was a 2, to this question answering list. That is, write out what happens when you add 2 to each of these elements, and so it's writing 6, 9, and 4. And then at the very end, it's saying, okay, take that pattern and add it to the position I asked you about, which was position 2. So it adds 2 and 2 and gets a 4. Okay, so there's kind of a lot going on there. Given the sort of short time of this talk, I don't have time to dive into all of the details, but you can see that things like representing syntax is happening because you have a list and the order of the items in the list matters, and you can query the order of the items in the list. It's also doing semantics, so it kind of knows what it means to add 2 to something. So it has a concept of 2, what comes before and after what in the number system. There's control, clearly, where you are focusing on different parts of the task at different moments in time, and the same inputs being shown a 2 or a 7 is being interpreted in very different ways depending on the particular point that you're at in the task as the model. And then there's a sort of kind of learning happening as well, where the particular pattern that was inferred was basically learned from the input that was provided to the model. Right, so this is hitting a bunch of the sort of main components that are identified in the semantic pointer architecture, sort of the techniques that were used to construct the model. And of course, we can also dive down into the sort of low-level details. So we can look at the tuning in V1, for instance. So this is comparing tuning in the V1 of the model to tuning in V1 of monkeys. And the nice thing about this data is exactly the same analysis techniques are used in the model and the data. So they both generate spikes, so you can use the same methods for generating these tuning curves, and you see that you have a lot of the same kinds of properties. We can also look at areas like the ventral striatum. This is during a reinforcement learning task, which I haven't shown you, but again, you can see that if we compare ventral striatal data from a rodent to that coming out of the model, and we look sort of over time as it's performing this reward-related task, that you get data which you can again process in the same kind of way and compare the dynamics and sort of low-level neural properties across these, the model and the biological data. But of course, we're also interested in sort of high-level comparisons. So in this case, let's look at some simpler instructions that the system can follow. So basically, we're distinguishing two types of instruction following. One is where the instruction is the same through the entire task. In this case, it'll be if you see a 1, write a 3. If you see a 2, write a 4. And essentially, the model comes to just learn or memorize that. And it becomes essentially very rote to respond with a 3 when a 1 is shown. Or we also have a more complicated instructed stimulus task. In this case, at every instant in the task, so for each trial, the model is given a different instruction. So for instance, here in the first trial, it's told, if you see a 1, write an 8. If you see a 2, write a 1. And in the second trial, it's told, if you see a 1, write a 2. If you see a 2, write an 8. So of course, we can perform these same kinds of tests on humans and look at what is the difference in reaction time between these two circumstances. And we can run the same thing on the model and see what happens. So just focusing on the blue, green, and red lines, hopefully these are reasonably self-explanatory. So the red line in particular, that's us running this Spawn 2.0 model, performing that task. The green line is the human data. And the blue line is us basically looking inside the model and saying, if we look at just the instruction processing part of the model, this is largely affiliated with the basal ganglia, what exactly is going on in that part of the model? And how long is processing taking there? And how much of the difference does that explain? And what we're showing on the right-hand side, essentially, is that if we just look at that part of the model and we take the difference in performance time, it explains essentially all of the variation, all of the sort of change in response time in the task. So this is now a hypothesis, which we can go and try to test in other ways. But we can see that this gives us a first indication that the model can sort of account for the timing that we see in human behavior, that it's kind of a combination of response choice and the sort of control that's happening inside the model through the basal ganglia, as well as the time it takes to execute motor commands and process visual input. But all of those things combined do actually quite a good job of reproducing the kind of performance changes that we see in those two instruction following cases. So let me give you a kind of high-level view of the model. So we can see that the model can do cognitive stuff. We can see that it can do low-level perceptual stuff. It's got a bunch of neurons in it. Of course, it can also be mapped onto a brain. This is sort of giving a high-level sense of that, where the sort of visual cortex is a standard hierarchy along the ventral visual stream. We have frontal areas, which are doing more memory and executive function monitoring, motor systems, and the basal ganglia there is in orange. It's actually subcortical. And it's communicating with all of these different components and determining how information should flow through the system. And you can see there's a lot of connections in here. All of the connections in this diagram are in the real brain. Also, it's important to note that although we're sort of looking at it as this anatomical kind of structure, ultimately when the model is running, it's really just simulating 6.6 million neurons. There's a bunch of connection weights between all those neurons. They have synapses, and the synaptic properties are determined by the kind of neurotransmitter that's there. It's kind of just a big mess of neurons, as you find in actual brains. So there's no sort of other code being simulated. There's no if-then statements. There's no sort of what you typically think of as like computer science type representations in here. They're all representations embedded in spiking neural networks. Now, this view is great when we're looking at thinking from a neuroscience perspective, right? It tells us what the properties of our model tend to look like. And there's particular physiological properties of basal ganglia, for instance, which are replicated in the model. So some of those projections are inhibitory and some of them are not. And so that kind of knowledge is included in the model. But we can also take a very sort of cognitive perspective where we look at this as a bunch of functional components interacting with one another, exactly the same model, but just from this perspective where we have each of these sort of components interacting and performing particular functions. And you can see at the bottom there you have an action selection system. So that's the basal ganglia. It's essentially getting inputs from everywhere, monitoring what's going on. And then it has outputs, which are determining what information flows from where to where. So at the beginning of one of those tasks, you might be having information flow from the visual input to the working memory. And when you need to respond later on, maybe information is flowing from working memory to motor output. In any case, when we take this perspective, it is exactly the same model, but you can see that we can sort of integrate our neuroscientific view and our cognitive or computational view. And doing so is happening in virtue of being able to write equations which describe all of the neural function, and also having methods for representing structures and so on inside this kind of model. And hopefully it's clear that the complexity we've added is given a significant function, right? We've gone from not being able to follow instructions to being able to follow reasonably sophisticated instructions. So it's difficult for me to talk too much about the methods we use here. In general, I refer to the sort of architecture, which SPAN is an example model of this general architecture, as the semantic pointer architecture. That is described in detail in this book, How to Build a Brain. It uses another set of methods for taking sort of high-level descriptions and embedding those into spiking neural networks, and those methods are called the Neural Engineering Framework, or NEF. And in that book, I sort of focus on 4 particular elements, all of which are represented in SPAN. So for instance, semantics, as I mentioned, representation of numbers and their relations is one example. Syntax, being able to represent lists and the order that items fall in those lists. Control, having the basal ganglia route information differentially through the system depending on task demands. And learning and memory, being able to remember information, obviously like lists of numbers. And learning, inferring new patterns and using those in subsequent parts of a particular task. And all of these things, of course, these are very cognitive science types of notions, but they're all implemented in spiking neurons, which are sort of biologically informed. So refer to that kind of in general as an approach to biological cognition. And the kind of representation that's being used there are semantic pointers. And this is hence the name semantic pointer architecture. But I'm not going to jump into that. Instead, let me wrap up by considering the role of development in this kind of modeling. So I think there's definitely different kinds of development and different things people have in mind when they use this term. One of these is captured by the notion of learning. And there's many different kinds of learning going on and being used to develop this kind of model. So there are some standard deep learning type techniques for building things like the visual system. This is offline, not really biologically plausible. And so in some ways, just a vague optimization method that we can kind of think as a computational technique, which has some, sort of effectiveness at building neurally based models. I think more interestingly from a developmental perspective is looking at online learning. So this is happening in several places throughout the model. This means that the model is running while it's learning and changing itself. Part of the model includes the cerebellum, and the cerebellum has the ability to essentially deal with changes in dynamics of the motor system. And this model has that. So I didn't show these results, but basically you can put the arm into weird force fields and the cerebellum can on the fly take care of the perturbations introduced by those force fields. The basal ganglia also does a kind of reinforcement learning, which I briefly showed you some neural data from. But more importantly, it's basically an example of the model sort of changing its weights in order to take into account unexpected task changes or rewards available in the environment. And right now, the reinforcement learning in SPAN is quite simple, really pretty basic TD learning. But it starts to move us in the direction of being able to account for development and changes in the system as a function of reward contingencies in the environment. And these are all kinds of development that happen in adult systems. For instance, we see things like changes in cerebellar performance and reinforcement type performance in adults. But we also can think of development from the perspective of changes over the lifetime. So we have done some work on essentially looking at aging, which in our hands has meant things like killing neurons and seeing what the consequences are. It has some really nice results there, particularly in looking at the changes in performance on intelligence tests. But again, I don't think that's typically what people mean when they think about development. It's mostly childhood development. And in our hands, I really think this is highly undercharacterized. So we haven't done a lot of work trying to understand exactly what's happening when children go from one stage of development to another. We have looked at things like if it's possible to learn the techniques that we're using to construct structured representations. So this seems to be something that happens a little bit later on in development when you begin to form analogies and so on. And the techniques to do that we're using are learnable. But we haven't really learned them online inside a large model like SPAN, which I think would be very interesting and exciting to do. Also looking at things like how representations change over the life of an agent, of a person or a model is something that, again, we have techniques for doing it, and we've done it a little bit in smaller models, but we haven't integrated into a really large scale model like SPAN. And that means doing things like learning about sort of changing your long-term memory, learning what kinds of representations are valid or not, learning how those representations apply to different tasks and so on. These are things that we can do and try to approach, but haven't been done at a scale that the rest of the SPAN model is at. So with that, I'd be happy to talk more about what those possibilities look like and also take other questions related to this particular approach at integrating neuroscience and cognitive science. And I'll just conclude with this sort of slide which summarizes that, I think the approach that we're taking is a useful one because we're really interested in function and how that relates to underlying neurobiology, but there's still a very long way to go. Obviously, SPAN is only 6.6 million neurons, nowhere near the 80 billion we find in human brains. But hopefully these kinds of tools, all of which are freely accessible to the research community, are helpful for pursuing exactly these kinds of questions. And maybe the time is right to begin to look more seriously at developmental issues. Thanks for your time.